Thank you for joining us today on EarthFile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. For Africa, green transition means transformation to a higher value-added economy that integrates net zero emissions into the pathway to zero hunger and zero poverty. But this requires bold decisions, we've been told, to be taken in the context of the reform of the international development architecture to fast-track this large-scale allocation of capital. The pathway forward to achieving this is our focus today on the program. Please stay with us.
Already fragile to economic and environmental shocks, Africa's vulnerability to climate risk factors have economic, environmental, and social and even political consequences for sustainable livelihoods. Africa's environmental degradation threatens its natural foundation for economic and social advancement. This threat is particularly noticeable in African economies where agriculture, forestry, or fishing still constitute a greater portion of the gross domestic product, with the majority of the populations dependent on the environment for major sources of incomes and livelihoods.
There's so much to tap from the business angle. We keep talking about Africa, about poverty, the emphasis is always on what is not there. Meanwhile, we have a lot that we can use to be able to generate a better livelihood standard of living for our people and better livelihood for our people. So there's a lot of money in carbon credit, there's a lot of money in greening the economy, but there's a lot of work to do to be able to harness it. And we have to come together as a continent. And Nigeria is a leader. So we need to play that leadership role.
Some schools of thought believe Africa has some urgent needs of economic and social development before moving on the green growth and preservations of the environment, which is considered a luxury. In view of this situation, African economies therefore prioritize domestic economic and social goals over creation of greener cities and preservation of the environment. But Nigerian Conservation Foundation says it is time to start rethinking this.
Communities and all, there's so much that they can benefit. There's so much that is there. They need to realize the importance of conserving the forest, of conserving the animals, of what we can do better to be able to realize better standard of living. Right now they think it's just subsistent living, that all you need to do is go and cut firewood and, well, if you conserve this, you can make more money. So we are ready, we need to be ready. If we don't, sensitize ourselves, we'll get left behind. We get left behind. And as a continent, there's so much for us to gain. So yes, the answer to your question is that we must be ready. We may not think we are ready, but that's why we need to push out the advocacy. Because once there's better understanding, then people will understand why they need to be ready.
For its 23rd Chief SLA Memorial Lecture, the NCF reflected on Africa's critical role in the global fight against climate change. Following the outcomes of COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan in 2024 and the newly secured $300 billion in annual carbon financing by 2035. This year's event underscored the need for Africa to leverage its natural resources, renewable energy potential, and youthful workforce to achieve climate-positive growth.
This is a whole of society approach. Over time, the private sector have been neglected in this conversation, but they play a very important role. And that is why it's very important to start bringing them in and start looking at conservation and climate change issues from the business angle of it and making sense out of it, so that people will see themselves in it. We want everybody to see themselves in it. The local communities have seen themselves in it because they are the ones being impacted directly by this. Conservation organizations, because that is what they are up to, they are seeing themselves in it. But the private sector has not really engaged in it as they should, because there has been this, it has been before as if it is either or. It shouldn't be conservation or development. They can go together. So that is where this conversation now, we are having these conversations, so that we'll be able to see that private sector can come together with everybody who are the players, so that because climate change impacts everybody. And we need all to be involved.
You're introduced like that, you better make sense. Yeah.
For Vice President Professor Yemi Osinbajo, who delivered the keynote on the theme, Greening Africa's economies. Can climate-positive growth deliver prosperity? The professor believes that Africa can indeed kill two birds with one stone. He told his audience that the continent can help the world meet its net zero targets by developing on a green pathway, or what is described as climate-positive growth. This is said will create jobs, wealth, and deal with extreme poverty.
But perhaps more importantly, it has become even evident that if African countries were to develop along the same carbon-intensive pathways of developed economies, that is to say that if African countries were to burn fossil fuels for industry and transport in the same way that the wealthier countries of the world have developed, then it will be impossible for the world to attain net zero by 2050 or any kind of decent targets, because Africa will then be adding 9.4 gigatons of CO2e annually until 2050, and we will become the leading emitters of dangerous gases globally, accounting for 75% of global emissions by 2050, if we do exactly what the developed countries of the world have done to attain the development to middle and high income status that they have today. So we can either be, when I say we, I refer to Africa, we can either be the nemesis of the world or the solution to the climate crisis. We can help the world, really, we can help the world meet its net zero target by developing on a green pathway, or what is described as climate positive growth, and wealth, and deal with extreme poverty.
It has been said many times that Africa's transition to a sustainable green continent is delayed by the growing exposure of economies to climate risks. Economic activities such as agriculture, forestry, and fisheries are exposed to high-risk weather events that further exacerbate its limitations to green industrialization. Africa is endowed with abundant natural resources, specifically lithium, graphite, cobalt, copper, and rare earth minerals. All are key components of the e-mobility transition and represent new market opportunities for net zero targets, as well as sustaining livelihoods. A green economy approach allows African countries to transition to a greener energy generation pathway and cater to their growing energy demand at the same time, supported by falling renewable energy costs, with solar panel prices dropping by 80% in the last decade and wind energy prices by 40%. The United Nations estimates the annual investment gap for renewable energy infrastructure to be between $380 billion and $680 billion, with focused policy interventions on the green economy. African countries have a huge potential to close the financing gap.
So the economic case for renewable technologies for manufacturing is getting stronger and stronger by the day. In other words, that we can actually use renewable energies for manufacturing as opposed to burning fossil fuels. Last year's IEA publication showed that already the total cost per kilowatt hour of grid-scale solar, including storage, is lower than that of gas-peaking technology, even without the valuing the fossil fuel price volatility and without putting a price on emissions. In other words, it is getting cheaper now to use solar power for manufacturing as opposed to even gas, which we know is relatively cheap. And that is improving day by day. In other words, it is getting cheaper and cheaper, literally by the day, to use renewable energy for manufacturing purposes. Africa's renewable energy is not only abundant, but also has very low seasonality or intermittency, which of course makes it possible to provide renewable baseload to power continuous industrial production. One of the chief problems, as you know, with using solar energy is seasonality or intermittency. In other words, the sun goes up at a particular point in time and then falls at a particular point in time, or goes down at a particular point in time. But the good thing about Africa is that that seasonality is very low. The changes are very, very low. And today with battery technology, it's even easier to store that power. Very recently, Malawi launched one of the biggest of those battery energy storage systems. And many countries in Africa are beginning to take advantage of some of the great progress that has been made in battery energy storage. That means that they can now use more effectively grid-scale solar for purposes of manufacturing. Industrial production and the use of low-carbon fuels, such as hydrogen and ammonia in manufacturing, is also becoming very popular. Of course, as well as the export of some of these products, ammonia and hydrogen. And there are so many opportunities that African countries are opening up already in green hydrogen manufacture, for example.
So far, Nigeria has been able to tap the green, social, and sustainable bond market to raise finance. Direct policy measures are required to attract such financing for more African countries. Burkina Faso, for example, has implemented a new investment code that lowers the performance obligations for investors in green and renewable energy sectors. Africa is also likely to embark on rapid urbanization, which needs better planning to develop more compact, resource-efficient cities.
A good starting point is processing its own raw materials. And we'll just take two examples of that. Turning iron ore to steel, for example, and then bauxite into aluminum. By 2050, nearly 40% of new city dwellers worldwide will be in African cities. Of course, that's related to the fact that Africa will become possibly the third largest, will by that time be possibly the second or third largest in terms of population. So African cities will be driving the massive need for construction materials like steel. Yet Africa currently produces less than 1% of the world's steel, even though it exports over 77 million tons of iron ore every year, mostly to Asia and Europe. At the same time, Africa imports nearly 6 million tons of steel from these regions. So if we processed iron ore into steel locally near the mines, it could eliminate 2/3 of transport-related emissions, over 5 million tons of CO2 per year. Additionally, new green steel plants in Africa could use renewable energy to produce hydrogen as fuel, cutting emissions from steel production itself by as much as 95%. And of course, combining local processing and reduced transportation, Africa could actually lower emissions by over 110 million tons of CO2 annually. And we can generate something in the order of about $25 billion in additional revenue, create about 24,000 direct jobs and another 215 indirect jobs in related industries. The 44 gigawatts of new renewable energy that is needed for this transition, and I'm talking about the transition from simply exporting ore to processing the iron ore into steel. What we require for that is 44 gigawatts of power. And that by itself would attract even more investment. So really it's an anchor demand situation that can be created simply by rather than exporting raw ores, manufacturing or processing those ores. Beyond economic growth, this would also help to reduce Africa's trade deficits. It will stabilize local currencies, create new supply chain opportunities for Europe.
Transitioning to green economy would create newer jobs as well as bring in more investors to Africa. This is crucial for Africa, with approximately 70% of the population below the age of 30 and newer entrants joining the workforce every year. For example, the United Nations Environment Programme estimates that the expansion of solar and wind capacity in Senegal will create up to 30,000 additional jobs by 2035. Green economy principles applied in the context of agriculture, land use and forestry activities could pave the way for drought mitigation and prevention of desertification in many sub-Saharan African countries, it has been said. The Great Green Wall Initiative set a great example by contributing to bringing life back to Africa's degraded landscapes at an unprecedented scale, providing food security, jobs, and reduced mitigation, all within a span of only a decade. It has been reported that natural capital is a critical economic asset and a source of public benefit, especially for poor people whose livelihoods depend on natural resources. Transitioning to an inclusive green economy therefore creates huge potentials for investment and job creation and has the potential to leapfrog African countries to the level of global peers in terms of responding to climate change.
Africa's economy is undervalued because it does not account for its vast ecosystems, including forests and wetlands, which has absorbed huge amounts of carbon dioxide. So there is the argument, and I think it's a valid one, that Africa's natural capital should be formally recognized and monetized. And I think it's only fair that countries that commit to preserving critical ecosystems for the benefit of the world should be compensated fairly for their role in that in climate action.
Climate action, which is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 13, is an international effort to harmonize Africa's contemporary industrial techniques with sustainable development. SDG 13 seeks to shift industries from unsustainable practices towards green economies. A green economy promotes green industrialization, designed to simultaneously promote natural systems and human well-being. Africa faces huge barriers in accessing prompt information and strategies to promote or advance green industrialization. These barriers include limited access to funding, weak legal and regulatory policy frameworks, and limited skills and technology to accelerate the transition of the continent to a green economy.
We also need to develop critical infrastructure, especially climate-resilient infrastructure, to support industry and trade. Again, some great work has been done. Africa in particular has promoted about 6 of these types of climate-resilient industrial parks all across Africa. And there is a lot of collaboration now going on also with the AFDB to at least set up some of the models that countries can actually work with. Now, what global cooperation is needed for climate positive growth? I mean, we've talked about what African countries should do, but what should the rest of the world do to make climate-friendly industrial growth a reality? The first is that we need to make the right investments and funding. That is to say that the world has to make the right investments and funding. And this is very important because we cannot talk about looking for 2050 zero carbon emissions, save the world by 2050, if the world is not prepared to accept the position that Africa is central to that coming to happen, to that coming to pass. It is absolutely important that the rest of the world sees this not just as, it is not, I mean, and Africa is no longer presenting any kind of victim story. We are saying that we are central to the world achieving its net zero objectives. And that just has to be taken as an economic and commercial proposition. And this is why it's so important that we cannot continue with the same financial systems that we have. So, Africa, for example, today faces higher borrowing costs due to real and perceived risks, which cancel out its natural advantages in climate-friendly industries.
Professor Shimbajo said for Africa to pursue a climate-positive growth path, it must, among other things, speak with one voice, as this is the key to getting its agenda recognized and incorporated into emerging global rules and instruments.
There are several different places where we have to influence policy, and that's global policy. And you cannot influence global policy if people are saying different things. So there's a need to speak with one voice. And this is key to getting our agenda recognized and incorporated into emerging global rules and instruments. The second thing that we need to do is to put our house in order and deal with the obvious governance issues of transparency and accountability, especially in public procurements. The protection of democratic processes and the rule of law, security, not just because of risk perception issues, but to give our people a fair chance to live well and to prosper. The third is to focus our economic growth and development plans on these green opportunities. In other words, we need to structure internal policies and regulations in such a way that support climate positive trade and industry. We cannot speak about climate positive growth. Again, practically all African countries through the AU have endorsed the paradigm as a correct paradigm, especially at the African Climate Summit in Nairobi. But we must go beyond the verbal assertions and the verbal affirmations. We must actually introduce policy and be consistent about policy in this respect.
But he did not forget to add that to achieve all these, developed countries must fulfill past promises, including the Paris Agreement commitments. The Loss and Damage Fund agreed upon at COP27 should be activated, he said. He also called for a reform of the global financial system.
Many of us heard about the Bridgetown Initiative and the Capital Adequacy Framework, which proposes to strengthen multilateral development banks so that they can lend more to emerging economies. There are technical solutions also like recycling, special drawing rights, blended financing, and risk mitigation strategies that can also help to reduce borrowing costs. But these are, of course, technical financial sorts of matters, but they are crucial if we are to reform the global financial system. The third is reducing the debt burden on African nations, and this has become so important. Most African nations are burdened with debt, and that follows from some of what I've said earlier. In other words, they are huge. The cost of borrowing is so high anyway, that the cost of servicing those debts naturally is very high, which is why many African countries are severely indebted and spend too much today on debt repayments, leaving very little room for climate investments.
At the end of the day, it was agreed that understanding the foundations for greening the economy and its implications for the vibrant sectors of the economy may be an important step in the discourse on sustainable development.
We've got to find new ways. Like Prof said here today, there are various ways. Hydrogen as energy is expensive. And if you say it is only private sector that will do it, it will be expensive until our governments sit together and African governments come together as a force to be reckoned with and say, look, we claim our rights. And this for us is the pathway. Agree to agree as a continent, like Europe does, like the Americas do, and come and say, we stand firm because we are the future of this make or break point of energy transition.
Yeah, we can't get it right when we come together. So we will not be discouraged. One step at a time, we will be able to get there. And we should not, because as I said, when we look at a bigger picture, then it makes us to be discouraged. But when we look at the small wins, gradually these small wins will come together. Different parts coming together, we'll be able to see how big the impact will be. So we will not be discouraged. We'll just be doing our bits one step at a time.
Although it has been said that a substantial portion of African economy has not responded positively to greening policies, largely due to poor advances on sustainable innovations for fostering green productivity, coordinated developments are said to be required to enhance the impact of the green productivity as climate change advances and the urgency to green African economies increases.
That's our show for the week. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.